Avengers Endgame was peak of the superhero genre in terms of hype and numbers. After Endgame, a movie that wrapped up over a decade of storytelling, Marvel faced an issue. Where do you go from here? The answer was apparently downward. The golden age of the MCU had given way to a sea of mediocrity, driven by a few key problems. In this video, we will discuss what went wrong with Marvel after Endgame. So, let's get started. The concept of the multiverse was teased as a major game-changer for the MCU, allowing for an infinite number of storylines, characters, and timelines. Multiverse really is a great concept after peak like Endgame, but instead of providing exciting new avenues for storytelling, it created confusion and inconsistency. Introducing the multiverse meant Marvel could essentially break all of its own rules. Characters could return from the dead, alternate versions of heroes could exist, and timelines could be manipulated without much consequence. The stakes that grounded the earlier phases of the MCU were suddenly obliterated. If anything can happen, why should the audience care about what does happen? For me, whole Infinity Saga felt useless and pointless after this one scene from Loki. Also, Marvel failed to properly explain the rules of the multiverse, leading to disjointed narratives. Multiverse in No Way Home, Loki and Multiverse of Madness seems to have different rules. No Way Home did nothing to explain about the multiverse, just we got to see Tobey's and Andrew's Spider-Man. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness was meant to be a pivotal moment for this concept, but the film was more focused on flashy cameos than a coherent exploration of how the multiverse works. The film's storytelling became a tangled mess, jumping from universe to universe without offering clear answers. Loki was good at exploring TVA, but bad at showing how multiverse works, how time actually works. Now with Deadpool and Wolverine, we got one more concept called anchor beings. Me. Audiences were left wondering, what's the point? If a character dies, does it even matter? If there's another version of them out there in some other universe played by the same actor, does anything really have emotional weight? The multiverse ended up undermining the gravity of the MCU's stories, creating a sense of detachment rather than wonder. Marvel hasn't done the groundwork to explain the rules of the multiverse in a way that makes sense to the average viewer. Instead, it feels like they're making things up as they go, leaving fans frustrated and detached. Marvel's dive into TV, which should have been a chance to explore deeper narratives, only made things worse. I remember when Marvel announced their shows. Felt like, yeah, they are making shows on characters who don't have theater pull, but still, I was optimistic. Shows like WandaVision kicked off with promise, experimenting with genre and storytelling, but as episodes went on, they collapsed under the weight of the same Marvel tropes. Then came The Falcon and The Winter Soldier. This was supposed to give us some post-Endgame clarity and introduce the next Captain America. Instead, we got a slogging narrative filled with underwhelming villains and a disjointed political message that tried to tackle real-world issues like this.
You've got to do better, Senator. You've got to step up.
I liked Loki. Indeed, a great show with good balance of story, acting, cinematography, etc. But again, felt like it was trying too hard to set up the next phase rather than telling its own story. Moon Knight, Loki, and WandaVision were good shows, but I don't know why. Their last episodes were just disappointing. Hawkeye and Ms. Marvel, both of which felt like filler content made to pad out Disney Plus rather than meaningful entries in the MCU. Let's just forget that She-Hulk even exists. And who the fuck asked for Secret Invasion, Echo, and Agatha show? Instead of providing quality content in this OTT era, they are just releasing too many mediocre shows. By the time Endgame rolled credits, audiences had already watched over 20 movies in the MCU. That's a lot of superhero action to digest. And for many, the novelty had worn off. Sure, Endgame felt like a satisfying conclusion, gave us many memorable scenes, but the superhero fatigue that had been whispered about for years was finally becoming real. And Marvel's response to this? More of the same. Sure, some films did great at the box office like No Way Home, Deadpool, and Wolverine, but they relied mostly on nostalgia and fan service. There wasn't a major shift in tone or direction post-Endgame. Instead, we got the same quippy humor, CGI-heavy battles, and cookie-cutter plotlines that audiences had already seen for over a decade. They had got a formula. First, our superhero life will be full of happiness and happening or slightly tough. Then something serious happens. A villain appears who will be for sure stronger than our hero. Whole world will be at stake in the end, no matter what our hero wins. Post-Endgame, every movie followed this formula except Eternals and Wakanda Forever. My point here is superhero fatigue is real. Biggest post-Endgame problem Marvel faced was oversaturation. Between the films and the TV shows, the MCU became a non-stop content machine. Even if there weren't any films or shows, they made sure for us to stick with them by releasing posters, trailers, announcements, and so on. The issue wasn't just that there was too much, it was that much of it wasn't worth the time investment. The sense of excitement that once accompanied every new MCU release faded. and the experience started to feel more like an obligation. Fans had to keep up with the movies and the TV shows just to stay current with the sprawling MCU narrative. The result? A fatigue that wasn't just about the superhero genre, but about the relentless pace of Marvel's output. Previously, each new MCU film was an event, something that could be anticipated and savored. Now, with content coming out at such a rapid pace, nothing felt special anymore. Audiences could barely get excited for one release before the next was already being promoted. The oversaturation diluted the impact of the MCU's stories, making each new release feel less like a cultural event and more like another episode in a never-ending series. Marvel also failed to recognize that with so much content, they needed to focus on quality, not just quantity. Instead of producing fewer, higher-quality films and shows, they overwhelmed fans with a barrage of mediocre content, which only amplified the feeling of burnout. One of the biggest strengths of the MCU in its first 3 phases was character development. Tony Stark's journey from self-centered billionaire to self-sacrificing hero. Steve Rogers grappling with his identity and sense of belonging in a modern world. Thor's journey from arrogant to noble king. These were heroes who grew and changed, making their stories compelling to watch. Post-Endgame, many of Marvel's heroes seemed to stagnate. Thor, once a compelling character dealing with loss and failure, was reduced to a walking punchline in Love and Thunder. Doctor Strange hasn't had much meaningful development since his first movie, instead becoming more of a plot device to introduce new concepts like the multiverse. Even newer characters like Shang-Chi and Eternals had their arcs rushed or underdeveloped, leaving audiences with heroes that didn't resonate emotionally. The lack of strong character arcs post-Endgame made it harder for audiences to connect with the stories on a deeper level. Without emotional stakes, it became harder to care about what happened to these heroes, and that emotional detachment made the overall experience less satisfying. When the MCU started out, every new release was an event. After Endgame, however, that magic seemed to vanish. Marvel was banking on the goodwill it had built over the years to carry them through the next phase, but it didn't work out. Sure, Far From Home did $1 billion at the box office because it was released just 2 months after Endgame, as still there was hype of that grand event film. Black Widow was the first big sign of trouble. Released in the middle of the pandemic, it had a lot of external factors working against it, but even so, the film failed to perform up to expectations. Then Shang-Chi hit theaters, and it was a decent film with some great action, basic yet good storyline, but it underperformed. Audience were slowly losing interest in MCU, and Eternals, positioned as a bold new direction for Marvel, this movie was supposed to introduce a whole new set of cosmic characters. Instead, it tanked. It was too long, too convoluted, and tried to cram in way too much lore. Audiences didn't care, and the box office reflected that. I agree, alternate theater releases were doing good, but it was not a good sign for a successful brand like Marvel. Phase 4 and Phase 5 included many box office duds like Black Widow, Shang-Chi, Eternals, Love and Thunder, Quantumania, and The Marvels. This string of disappointments led to a sobering realization for both Marvel and its fans. The brand isn't bulletproof anymore. One of the biggest sins Marvel committed post-Endgame was assuming that audiences would keep showing up no matter what. After years of high-quality films, they believed they could put out anything, and people would eat it up. And for a while, that was true. But post-Endgame, fans started to realize they were being sold a product, not a story. The heart that had made movies like Iron Man, The Winter Soldier, Guardians 1, Black Panther, and Ragnarok is gone. This attitude was most obvious in the way characters were handled. Take Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. The movie was hyped up as a major event, something that would reshape the entire MCU. Instead, what we got was a mess of CGI and underdeveloped ideas that left fans confused and unsatisfied. It felt like Marvel was dangling the multiverse as a shiny object, expecting audiences to be dazzled without actually delivering a coherent or compelling story. At this point, the MCU has turned into a never-ending setup machine. Each movie or TV show feels like it's just there to introduce the next one, with no real resolution or sense of satisfaction. Marvel used to be able to balance this long-form storytelling with individual arcs that felt rewarding. Now, it just feels like we're being strung along from one mediocre release to the next, with the promise that it'll all make sense eventually. That's all from my side. Thanks for watching.